If you're here for the first time, we're, like Ingrid said and a few others, we're on a journey in the book of Daniel. There's only 12 chapters, so we're almost to the end. This is Daniel chapter 11. I've entitled it Power Struggles. If there's one fact that is undeniable, whether we look at world politics, world history, political campaigns, the economical world, churches through history, and in our own families, and even in our own hearts, the number one issue I think that is creating the most problem in the world is the fact that people have a desire for power. How can I win this battle? How can I win this argument? How can I beat my opponent? How can I come out on top? And I'm not just talking about physically. Sometimes we just want to win with arguments. Sometimes we want to win because of where we are in life compared to others. And so Daniel 11 is really about this power struggle. And I find it ironic because the one individual, the one entity in this world who has the ultimate power, which is God, I really don't see him as one who likes to flex his muscles. Yet we know, and if you don't know, let me reveal this to you today, that he is going to win. And it's ironic that the one who is going to win, who can win, is the one who flexes his muscles the least. Maybe it should be a lesson for us. The interpretation of Daniel chapter 11 has been largely contested for years. As a matter of fact, when I decided to do a sermon series on the book of Daniel, I hesitated just because of Daniel 11. Recently, in 2019, at the Village 7 Adventist Church in Berrien Springs, Michigan, there gathered a blend of scholars with expertise in biblical Hebrew, as well as lay people without formal training. The forum involved professors from Andrews. For those of you who don't know what that means, it's a 7 Adventist University. Andrews, Oakwood is another one. There were some scholars from Oakwood. There were also some scholars from Austria, from the Bogenhofen Theological University. And all of these people gathered to discuss Daniel chapter 11. So do you realize how little that makes me feel right now? I am not a Daniel scholar. I am not a scholar. So what I'm about to present to you, which goes along with the most popular of the three views that they came up with in this debate. Within the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there are three views on what Daniel 11 is talking about. Now, never mind, I started going on evangelical websites and other churches, so I can multiply 3 by 100. There are probably 300 views on what Daniel chapter 11 means. So let me just do this disclaimer right off the bat. What I'm about to share with you is to hopefully awaken you a desire to figure it out for yourself. Now, I also have to share with you that, and you know this, I've shared this from the beginning, that this sermon series is based on a book written by a man named Mark Finley, who is a very trusted and well-respected evangelistic preacher in the Seventh-day Adventist Church and has been for over 50 years. And the view that I agree with is also the view that he agrees with. So, take it for what it means. Take it for what it means. The three views, the view that I'm going to share with you today on Daniel chapter 11 is a position called papacy versus atheism. The other two is papacy versus Islam, and the other one is Turkey versus Egypt. So there you go. And if you wish to read the article, I put the website up there. You just put Adventist Review, or you just put what does Daniel chapter 11 mean, and put Berrien Spring, Michigan in a Google search, and you'll be able to go there and you can read it for yourself, the arguments for each position and all these different things. And I know some of these scholars. 2 of them were teachers of mine. And so I know, not all of them, I know some of them. And some of them I respect, and some of them I don't. I do not agree with their position on certain things. So you see right away that people can take the same chapter and have totally different views. So here we go. This chapter is loaded with power struggles. Hence the reason for this image. Loaded with power struggles. And it seems to me that it is incredibly relevant in the world that we live in today. It seems to me that we live in an age, you know what, I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to skip all that and let's get right to it. I told my wife that I would rant, and I'm not going to rant. I'm just going to keep going. I'm just going to keep going. I'm just going to keep going. Oh, you have no idea how difficult it is to be up here. You have no idea. Daniel chapter 11. Gives us intricate details of political struggles within each of the following eras. The Medo-Persian era, which are covered by the verses that are there. The Greece era, which are covered by the verses there. And the Rome era, which are covered by the verses there. And I do not want to spend time discussing the historical intricacies of these specific kingdoms, because they have come and gone. But it is a very interesting study to look into how Daniel, in chapter, which he wrote about things he had no idea about, how intricately detailed these verses actually prophesy about history and the power struggles within those kingdoms. But I'm not going to spend the time on those, because there's a deeper message of Daniel chapter 11 for people who are further down the future from Daniel, which happens to be us. And it's hidden under the guise of the king of the north and the king of the south. And what I'm suggesting to you at this point, or what's going to happen at some point in Daniel chapter 11, is that we go from literal to prophetic. Do you know what I mean by that when I say that? Is that when Daniel is literal, it means that whatever he says or whatever is written there, you can take it for what it says to the people or to the nation that it applies to. But at some point, it becomes prophetic, meaning that it is talking about something that's going to happen that hasn't happened yet. And we call that dual prophecy, meaning that it means something to the people of the day to who it was written to, but it also means something to the people in the future. You're following me? I'm telling you right now, I'm going to lose most of you within about 5 minutes. So you got to pay attention. Those of you who are snoring, I see you. I've been writing your names over the last 6 months. So, but it's going to be hard for you to follow if you're nodding off. I can tell you that right now. So we're talking about dual prophecy. So it meant something for Daniel, but the symbols also mean something for us, a dual purpose. And I'm suggesting that under this concept of dual prophecy, Daniel 11's kings are both literal and symbolic. Okay, Sophie, you're shaking your head, which means you got it. All right. And we see a repetition of the same sequence in each of the prophetic chapters of Daniel. We talked about Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 8, Daniel 9. These are all prophetic. And the interesting thing about prophecy, and this is where a lot of denominations get it wrong, is that we believe in a historicist approach to prophecy, which means outline prophecy, which means that every single prophecy talks about the same timeline, but just adds a little detail every time. Follow me? Okay, good. So let's review. We talked about Babylon. We talked about Medo-Persia. Remember the statue with the head of gold? Right? And remember the lion that came out with wings in Daniel chapter 7? And we talked about Medo-Persia. This area which was made of silver. And then this bear. And we even talked about a he-goat in Daniel chapter 8. Right? Then we talk about Greece and Rome. And we see the breakup of Rome in the 10 divisions. The beast with 10 horns. The statue with 10 toes. You still following me? Okay. Right? And it was followed by the rise of a little horn power. Representing the union of church and state. This is new. This is new now. This little horn power represents the union of church and state that obscures the truth about Jesus and his work where? Yes. Oh man. You guys are on the heavenly sanctuary. And that we've unraveled all of this so far. So if it's your first time here, poof, I just dropped a load of information on you. We have no reason to think, I have no reason to think, the Seventh-day Adventist Church has no reason to think that Daniel 11 would veer off from this outline prophecy, this historicist approach, from all the other visions of Daniel chapter, of the rest of the book of Daniel. So, I guess my question would be, and probably what you want to know, that's why you're all here in numbers, and we filled up the place. For those of you online, what can Daniel 11 add to this already well-explained and well-defined line of events from the other visions? Right? Is that what would you guys like to know that? Okay, me too. Because the king of the north and the king of the south are the new players. They have not been revealed in any other prophecy. So, we find these three kingdoms that we talked about earlier, these three kingdoms here. In this chapter, we read about numerous battles back and forth between political powers. The fourth kings of Medo-Persia that it talks about at the beginning of chapter 11. We know them. It's Cambyses, Sotosmerdis, Darius, and Ahasuerus. We know from history and from archaeology that these kings existed, and they fit exactly with Daniel 11 verses 1 and 2. We also know of the great king who conquered Medo-Persia in verses 3 and 4, and his name is Alexander the Great, and that his kingdom was divided amongst his generals. He died young, and these generals were Ptolemy, Cassander, Seleucus, and Lysimachus. That's what Daniel 11 verses 3 and 4 talk about, and all the way to verse 11. Now, what's interesting to note here is Ptolemy, who was one of Alexander's generals who took over after Alexander died, was ruler over the south. He became the ruler of the Egypt area of the kingdom of Greece. And so chapter 11 introduces Egypt under Ptolemy, verse 5, under Ptolemy as the king of the south. And like I said earlier, we begin the unraveling of dual prophecy. Inasmuch as Egypt was a literal foe of both Greece and Rome, over the span of those kingdoms, Egypt also has a spiritual meaning. There we go, all these fancy names that I just said earlier. Egypt, down through the centuries, was a nation that rebelled against the God of heaven. In the time of Moses, which is all the way back to the book of Exodus in the Bible, in the time of Moses, the Egyptian Pharaoh defied God and he refused to free Israel out of bondage. You may know that story. Let my people go. And when we think of Egypt, we think of this defiance and rebellion against God. When we think of Egypt, we think of a power that opposes God. Okay, you following me? Literal Egypt. Now we're going into spiritual Egypt. So when in Daniel 11 we read about the king of the south, we are not just talking about literal Egypt, but in a broader sense, in a spiritual sense, in the conflict of good and evil, the king of the south is a power that shakes its fist in the face of God. So, I believe that Egypt, as the king of the south, symbolizes rebellions and defiance towards God. And as we read through Daniel chapter 11, we read about the king of the south and the king of the north, and these directions are actually relative to where Israel was. And you're going to tell me, well, wait a minute, that arrow is pointing west or east. It's not pointing north. Jerusalem is in the center where those arrows start, and we see that Egypt is kind of southwest from Jerusalem, and Babylon is directly east. But where did Babylon have to go in order to oppress God's people? Did they walk through the desert? No. They went northwest and came down southwest. So therefore, Babylon can still be seen as the king of the north. And now you're starting to see why some positions will be Turkey and Egypt. You get it? Turkey is directly north and Egypt is almost directly south. So some people are taking that maybe too literal. You can look for yourself at the research and decide for yourself. So really, Babylon, in order to be able to access Jerusalem, had to come from the northeast part. Like Egypt, Babylon was a power that opposed the true God. It signified confusion because we get the root of Babylon from the Tower of Babel. And the Tower of Babel is a symbol of confusion because God came down as they were building this tower to try to defy God that He will never destroy the earth again with the flood. And God struck down this tower and confused their language, and everybody went their way. And hence we have the different nations from that point on. Some people will believe. And how can you build a tower when you got some dude speaking French and another guy speaking Spanish and another person speaking patois? And it's not going to work. How many bricks? How many? Deux. It's not going to work. Confusion and religious apostasy. It is repeated so many times in the book of Daniel that Babylon is made up of magicians, soothsayers, sorcerers, and many, many, many gods. So these terms, king of the south and king of the north, they stand for Egypt and Babylon respectively, but they stand for much more than just the nations itself, but rather how they related to the God of heaven or the God of Israel. So the king of the south, I'm sorry, I don't think you can read that, can you? I thought I was getting fancy with this writing, but the king of the south, defiance and rebellion, Egypt, and the king of the north, Babylon, spiritual confusion and religious apostasy. Anybody know what apostasy means? Because I'm using all these words and not everybody necessarily knows. Apostasy is to veer off from what has been considered to be a fundamental belief. That's what apostasy is. And most of the time apostasy results of a mixing of paganism with truth. Which is exactly what the little horn did. I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's see where the shift happens. This is very interesting. The shift from literal to spiritual. Are you guys still following me so far? Okay, so Egypt and Babylon, literal, but now we're going into the spiritual, symbolic, and these is what they mean symbolically. Because there's no more Babylon, and Egypt is not the splendor it used to be. As you can see from this slide, we believe that Daniel 11, verses 20 to 30, talk about the kingdom of Rome and their power struggles throughout that kingdom. It talks about some very interesting things that are literal and then become symbolic. I would like for you to go to Daniel chapter 11, and we're just going to take on just 3 verses, just for you to see, and whether you agree or not, that this would be bringing in Rome. Daniel chapter 11 and verse 20 and to 22. And we start at verse 20. It says, "There shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger or in battle." So you have to do a little digging with every single one of these verses, because every single one of these verses symbolizes or literally talks about something that actually happened in the history of Rome. And so a note of interest here is, so the glorious kingdom in apocalyptic literature here, the glorious kingdom signifies what? If you had to guess. Israel, God's people. All right, so now we bring in God's people. And it talks about this imposition of taxes. And if I take you to Luke 2 verse 1, I'll just read it. It came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. It was Augustus' decree that brought Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem, because they had to go to their hometown to register and pay their taxes. And interestingly enough, history proves that Caesar Augustus died very early after he came into power. And interestingly enough, he didn't die in battle, or he died because he got sick. Which is exactly what this verse says. Within a few days, he shall be destroyed, not in anger or in battle. So nobody was upset, wanted to take his place and kill them or murdered him. And he didn't die in battle. He died of sickness, just like the Bible says. And then if we read on, verse 21, "And in his place shall arise a vile person." Vile means not good. "To whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably and seize the kingdom by intrigue." If you look at history, the person who followed Caesar Augustus was Tiberius. Interestingly enough, Tiberius was not considered to be royalty. He was not considered to be the one who should be there, but he did it anyways. Just like the Bible predicted. He was shrewd. History tells us that he burned down villages of any who would oppose his rule. And in verse 22, it says, "With the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and be broken." This is so not fair. Who is they? I wish it would give us more details. Who is they? Now, I'll give you a hint. Let's keep reading. It says, sorry, I have a hard time to see. With the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him and be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. Who's a prince of the covenant? Jesus Christ. Was Jesus Christ a Jew? Could they be referring to the people of the glorious land? And we know from history that in 70 AD, that temple was destroyed. The Jews were annihilated. They were spread out. It's called a diaspora in historical terms, where the Jews had to flee their home. And here we have a prediction of the destruction of Jerusalem and of the killing of Jesus Christ himself. He will be broken, and so will they. So it helps us a little bit to situate ourselves in this. Jesus Christ is the one who allows for the transition from literal to prophetic. Did you hear that? The transition happens at or very shortly after Jesus' death. Here's how I'm going to prove that or support that. Because, like I said, there's smarter people in Andrews who think otherwise. So, well, some think like that, and some don't. Until Jesus' death, Egypt, Babylon, and Israel were taken to be literal. But after Jesus' death, all those nations became symbolic. For example, just 3.5 years after his death, and trust me, I'm getting somewhere with this. I just have to build the case. I'm getting somewhere. Please just be patient. And then after, you can have stones outside, if you want. But just follow me through. 3.5 years after Jesus' death, Israel was no longer exclusively the chosen people of God. How do I know that? Yeah, you're right, the stoning of Stephen guy, but that doesn't prove anything. What did prophecy say would end at the stoning of Stephen? You remember? The 70 weeks that we talked about in Daniel chapter 9, which 70 weeks equals 490 years, which began in 457 BC, which ends in 34 AD. No, I'm not that good at math. I just memorized it. 34 AD, 3.5 years after Jesus died. The Bible says that is the time that will be cut out, determined for his people. After which, Israel becomes spiritual, no longer literal. Which means that if you accept Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, you are spiritual Israel. It couldn't happen until Jesus died. It couldn't happen until Jesus had died. That is the line of transition. So let's follow, and there's a verse in the Bible that talks about that. It's in Galatians chapter 3, verse 28 to 29. It says, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there's neither male nor female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Who was Paul saying this to? Jews? Gentiles? This is why he wasn't liked by the Jews. You're bringing these people in with us? They're our equals? Are you crazy? Jesus is the great equalizer. It's finished. Don't think you're special because you supposedly have Abraham's blood running in your vein, because guess what? That Samaritan woman, that person from Corinth, they also have Abraham's blood running through their vein if they accept Jesus Christ as their personal Savior. We're done with the special people. You had a purpose, you had been called for something, but unfortunately, you failed. Because you thought that because of me calling you, it made you special. And the only reason why I called you is so that you would call other people. But that's not what you did. I can't let you go on like this. But Paul got it. That's why he went to everybody else and told them about the good news. Because he wanted them to be part of that kingdom too. Okay, enough. This principle of going from literal to symbolic, I like to suggest, also applies to Egypt and to Babylon. By the time of Christ, Babylon had long been gone, and like I said, the splendor of Egypt and its riches and its pride had largely failed into insignificance. They were no longer major players on the world scene, but they did powerfully symbolize two ideologies. The ideology of the king of the north and the ideology of the king of the south. And they are spiritual confusion and apostasy, defiance and rebellion against God, antagonism towards God, and mixing of error and truth. So following the sequence we have seen in prophetic chapters of Daniel so far, we would now expect chapter 11 to focus our attention on an apostate religious and political power that would arise following the breakup of Rome. We would expect a departure from the beautiful message of righteousness by faith centered on the sacrifices, the death and resurrection, and the heavenly work of Jesus Christ, and transitioning it to salvation by works, traditions, rituals, and rites. And that's exactly what we find all the way in verses 26 all the way to verses 27. And again, I wish I could spend all this time with you in verses 26 to 37 and unravel each and every single one of these verses. But there are some that are pretty obvious. I think it's, is it verse 30? Sorry, I should be more prepared than this, eh? Yeah, it's in verse 36. And actually, I'll have it up in a little later. One second, I'm ahead of myself. In these days we're living in, the conflict, I think, is slowly shaping itself up to be over worship and loyalty to God. Just as it was in Daniel chapter 3, when they were brought before the statue and they were asked to bow down and worship this image. And if they didn't worship it, they would be thrown into the fiery furnace. You see, sometimes this may be a nice little bedtime story for your children, but it's also prophetic. See, what these people did there was, what happened there was called enforced worship. If you don't bow down, you die. And in Daniel chapter 6, it's the opposite. It's prohibited worship. If you don't pray to the king and you pray to any other god, well, we're going to throw you into the lion's den. And those are the two issues that will come up at the time of the end. Enforced and prohibited worship. We believe that there is a sleeping giant soon to be awakened where church and state will unite in an apostate religio-political power that attempts to change God's law and lead men and women to disobey God and worship the counterfeit that it will set up. I'm glad this is recorded because you may have to read that again to swallow it. It's a big pill, like the zinc pill that I have to take. I hate taking it. It almost makes me want to vomit every time I take it. It's too big. And this is explained, this sentence that I just said is explained in Revelation chapter 13. Now, I did preach a whole series on the book of Revelation, so you can go back and look at that sometime. But you know what's interesting about all this is that God always has a people who remain loyal, obedient, and true no matter what the cost. This has been the fact all the way through history, and it's going to continue to be the fact all the way to the end. As a matter of fact, go to verse 32. Verse 32 actually, I believe, describes the Reformation. Verse 32 and 33, it says, "Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. But the people who know their God shall be strong, and they shall carry out their great exploits." And verse 33, "And those of the people who understand shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by the sword and flame, by captivity and plundering." Many days here, in my opinion, equates to 1,260 years, 300 days, 3.5 years, 42 months. Boom! Here's another bombshell I just dropped. We talked about this in the past. This is talking about persecution. People who stand for what is right and yet die for what they believe. And now we enter our time. Let me finish. The time of economical and industrial revolution that spans over hundreds of years. Knowledge is increasing. Inventions are made. And people begin to pull away from the authority of the church. And they began to think for themselves. And here is where we get into the conflict of ages between the symbolic spiritual king of the north and king of the south. As stated earlier, Babylon, throughout Bible prophecy, is a symbol of spiritual confusion, false religion, man-made traditions. This spiritual Babylon is not really exposed until you really take a deeper look into Revelation chapter 14, 17, and 18. Here I am again throwing you information. But when we start studying these chapters in the book of Revelation, skillful interpretation reveals that this Babylon is the exact same power as the little horn in Daniel chapter 7, which exalts itself above God, which is the papacy, the Roman Catholic Church. We believe that during the time of the end, which we believe is now, the king of the north represents the papacy. And then I know what question is lurking in your mind now. Well, who's the king of the south? Now remember, Egypt was a nation of lavish splendor and enormous wealth and shaking its fist as God, as if God doesn't exist. And it was Pharaoh who mocked God by saying, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice?" Those were his exact words. And although Egypt had multiple gods, it was one who rejected the God of Israel. And as such, I believe that the king of the south represents atheism. And we see that in verses 40 to 45 in the Daniel chapter 11. These features can be found in Europe in the end of the Middle Ages. Then we have the French Revolution in the 18th century. The age of reason. There is no God. Then in the teachings of Darwin in the 19th century, doing away with creation and creating evolution. Then we have the rise of communism in the 20th century. There is no God. And must I mention the 21st century and the strong secular humanistic thrust that we are under today in the 21st century, where human rights are becoming the Lord of our existence. And of course, humanism has done some good. Sometimes the little voices, those who are discriminated against, need a voice. I get it. Is it possible, though, that this movement has gone too far? We also interpret from Daniel chapter 11, verses 40 to 45, that there will be a time of international crisis, political turmoil, and worldwide uncertainty that will give rise to the church and state union under the papacy to battle against, this is unbelievable, against the secular powers of this world, and will dominate them for a short period. Follow with me. Verse 40. Let's read it together. So what I'm saying here, I know you guys are getting tired. I know. I'm almost done. What I'm saying is that verse 40 to 43 describes a battle between the king of the north and the king of the south. Meaning a battle between papacy, the Roman Catholic Church, and atheism. At the time of the end, you see, this is how I know that it's at the end. We're at the time of the end, right? We agree on that. At the time of the end, verse 40, the king of the south shall attack him, and the king of the north shall come against him. Like a whirlwind with chariots, horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter the countries, overwhelm them, and pass through. He shall enter the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but they shall escape from his hand, Edom, Moab, and the prominent people of Ammon. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall have power over the treasures of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt. Also the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall follow at his heels. Is this talking about literal Egypt? I don't think so. Is this talking about literal Libyans? And is it talking about literal Edom and Moab? No, these are all symbols of people, of mindsets, of ideologies. I don't know what they specifically are. I'm not prepared to defend that at this point. But what I am suggesting in these 3 verses is that the king of the north fights with the king of the south and wins. Follow me, I'm almost done. Verse 44, but the news from the east and the north shall trouble him. This is troubling the king of the north. Therefore he shall go out with great fury to destroy and annihilate many. East always symbolizes what? East symbolizes God. God's way, salvation. The tabernacle, the door was pointing to the east. News coming from the east is salvation. Salvation by faith. It is the truth about God. It is God after Reformation, after persecution, after 1780, after the 1260 years, that becomes to be known all over the world. The good news and the truth began to be preached after 1844. We learned that. The truth about the heavenly sanctuary, which symbolizes salvation by faith. It was a weak voice at the beginning. It was a weak voice. Even early on in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, it wasn't a voice at all. Because our church was founded on salvation by works. I'm not ashamed to say it. It's the truth. It's historically true. We came out of the same movement as everybody else. And we just followed right along until light was shown. Light was shown, yeah. It was a weak voice, but this voice is a voice that brings back the beautiful message of Christ's work in the heavenly sanctuary and identifies Satan's snares and conniving plans through the little horn and others. Revelation 13 calls it harlot, Babylon, the mother of harlots. Babylon is the king harlot, and then there's others along with it who are little harlots. Nobody likes to be called a whore. And here, this is not out of spite. It's simply that Babylon is a whore because it's mixing something true with something that's false. It's called spiritual adultery. You following? This is all apostasy. This is all spiritual. A work of justice and salvation begun in 1844 to decide where everyone ends up. And the devil, I'm done, almost done, and the devil will give a last powerful effort to destroy all those who choose Jesus Christ as their personal Savior with salvation by faith. The Bible describes them in Revelation 12:17. He calls them the remnants who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. In Revelation 12, it is Satan's battle to snuff out God. And at the end, he ends up turning his effort to only one people. He leaves everybody else behind, and he turns to one people. The Bible calls them the remnant, those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Against those, the devil makes his last stand. But he will not win. Last verse, 45. And he shall plant, he is the king of the north, he shall plant the tents of his palace between the seas and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end, and no one will help him. The little horn will seem to be winning. It will have conquered the king. Follow me. This is important. He will conquer the king of the south, which is symbolized by secularism, humanism, and materialism. It will stand as the emblem of salvation, saving this earth from sure implosion. It has its theology symbolized as the tabernacles of his palace in every country in the world, symbolized by seas. And it will complete its work of crushing those who oppose it on the basis of the commandments of God and salvation by faith. But it will end alone. Is there a religious system today that promotes asceticism? Fancy word for severe self-discipline and avoidance of all forms of indulgences. Is there a religious system today that stands against humanism, against abortion, against gay marriage, against self-assisted suicides? We, in my opinion, are right in the middle of the battle between the king of the north and the king of the south. And soon, I don't know when, the fight will transition against the remnants of God. Those who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. And I believe, and so does the Seventh-day Adventist Church, that this will revolve around a day of worship. Saturday versus Sunday. I know. This is so confusing. This is so much to take. I know. That's why I told you need to do your own studies. And I know it's hard too, because who do you believe? What do you believe? But I like Daniel chapter 11 because I think it rules out a lot of junk in theology that's out there today. Because Daniel 11 at the end is talking about the time that we live in. And trust me, the battle is much bigger than just a vaccine. The battle is much bigger than a government forcing you to wear a mask. I know some people believe that this may be the beginning of something, and that's very possible. But here Daniel is giving us a much bigger picture. That at some point, at some point, I don't know when, I don't know how, that the king of the north is going to become incredibly influential and will fight the king of the south and win, somehow convincing people that these things that we do are wrong. People will side with the king of the north and end up fighting the last people who tend to get in the way of the agenda of who rules the king of the north. Ultimately, Satan. Okay. That's it. And I trust Mark Finley as a preacher and a man of God who has lived his whole life to tell people the truth across this globe. And wisely, he and many others, like many others, do not give dates and specifics, but only this outline, which is much like the outline of Daniel chapter 11. We just don't really know. But let me bring this home. I got a little bit more to say. Because this has to be relevant. Because right now it's just a bunch of hoopla. If you decide to follow God and live a salvation by faith in a life of obedience, you will be tested. That's the bottom line. A believer in God is opposed to both secularism and atheism. And what better way to deceive the world than for apostasy to fight secularism in order to bring order back to this chaotic world that we have here today? Satan's most popular weapons that he has perfected over the last 500 years, apostasy and secularism, will end up fighting each other to grab everyone he can for the last great battle. Everywhere we turn, God's truth is either twisted, apostasy, or is disposed as fairy tale, atheism. If you choose to stand for God, you will be caught between these two. You will be caught in the middle of this battle. And you will become more and more different and more weird. Yes, we are called to be in the world, but we're also called to not be of the world. You can either join the battle and fight, and fight, and fight, and fight, or you can live for Jesus and let God fight for you. At least that's what Daniel chapter 12 verse 1 seems to be saying. At that time, Michael shall stand up, the great prince who stands watch over the sons of your people. And there shall be a great time of trouble, that last battle, such as never was since there was a nation, even to that time. And at that time, your people, Daniel, your literal Israel, and the spiritual Israel shall be delivered. Everyone who is found written in the book of life.